The heavy iron gates of Riverton Correctional Facility groaned as they slammed shut behind Officer Amelia Roberts, the sound echoing off the cold stone walls. She stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the metal sink in, the familiar feeling of the outside world slipping away with every inch that the gate closed. Her heart raced in her chest, and despite the cold February wind cutting through her uniform, beads of sweat formed on her brow. The brisk chill seeped through her clothing, biting at her skin, but it wasn't just the weather that made her shiver, it was the daunting new reality she was stepping into. For the past 5 years, Amelia had served in the general ward of the prison, where the inmates were dangerous, but their motives were straightforward. Inmates in Riverton's general ward were there for the crimes they committed, no more, no less. She had grown used to the routine, the hardened glances, and the hostile silence. But now, she was about to enter a different world. Today was different. Today, she was being transferred to Unit 9, the most notorious section of Riverton Correctional Facility, where the inmates were said to be more than just criminals. This was where the worst of the worst were kept, the men whose actions defied comprehension. Some said they had crossed lines that no one should ever come back from. For the first time, Amelia felt the weight of her uniform, the responsibility heavier than it had ever been. She knew this wasn't just another day at the prison. This was the beginning of something that would challenge her every belief, every rule she had followed for the last 5 years. The sound of her boots clicking on the cold, hard floors echoed down the long hallway as she walked behind Warden Michael Calloway. His presence was commanding, almost overwhelming. Tall, with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through her, he exuded authority in every step. His uniform was impeccably pressed, his posture rigid, and his voice carried the weight of experience and power. "This isn't like the rest of the prison, Officer Roberts," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "Unit 9 is a different breed of place. These men, they're not like the others. Don't get too comfortable. Don't ever let your guard down for a second. Trust me when I say this, these inmates are capable of anything. They will test you. They will push you. And they will make you question everything you know." Amelia nodded, trying to mask the nervousness crawling up her spine. She glanced down the hallway as they walked, the oppressive silence of the place almost suffocating. The walls were a dull, faded gray, the air thick with the scent of chlorine, sweat, and something darker, something more permanent. The cells lining the hallway were solitary, each one housing a man who had crossed a line that most couldn't even imagine. Amelia glanced at the other prisoners as they passed. Their eyes followed her, some curious, others filled with a quiet, almost predatory interest. She could feel their gazes on her, the weight of their stares pressing against her back. It was a new sensation, unlike anything she had experienced before. But there was one cell that stood out. Cell 213. A man sat motionless inside, reading a book by the faint glow of the dim corridor lights. His figure was tall and lean, but what struck Amelia the most was his gaze, the intensity of it. As she passed, their eyes met. There was no malice in his look, no anger or aggression, just a cold, unnerving calmness. It was a gaze that seemed to see right through her, dissecting her every thought. It was the kind of gaze that unsettled her to her core. The man didn't blink. Instead, he placed the book down slowly, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of the pages. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he smiled, almost politely. "Good evening, Miss Roberts," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, and strangely calm. "I'm Jonathan Hale. Welcome to our humble little sanctuary." His words, though courteous, carried an undercurrent of something deeper. There was a respect in his tone, but it felt calculated, as if he were waiting for something. Amelia couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt a twinge of unease settle in her stomach. The smile on his face didn't reach his eyes. His piercing gaze remained fixed on her, as though he was studying her, measuring her reaction, waiting for her to respond. "Thank you, Mr. Hale," Amelia managed to say, her voice betraying none of the unease she was feeling. She glanced at the neatly arranged cell behind him, the perfectly made bunk, the few personal items neatly placed on the desk, the book he had been reading. It was all too pristine, too controlled for a man incarcerated in a maximum security prison. She should have moved on, should have kept walking, following Warden Calloway's lead, but something held her there. Something about Jonathan Hale's calm demeanor, his composed words, and the unsettling nature of that calmness kept her rooted to the spot. She tried to ignore the nagging feeling that had begun to creep over her, trying to focus on the task at hand, trying to remind herself that she was a guard here, not a guest. And yet, as they walked away from cell 213, Amelia couldn't shake the image of his eyes that had felt like they were burning into her, challenging her. She had been around criminals for 5 years, but this felt different. There was something about Jonathan Hale, something she couldn't quite understand yet. What kind of man was he? And what kind of trouble had she just stepped into? The next few days at Riverton Correctional Facility passed in a blur. Amelia had expected the transition to Unit 9 to be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated how quickly it would change her. Every day, she fought to keep her focus sharp, to stick to the rules, to maintain the boundary between herself and the inmates. But no matter how hard she tried to push him out of her thoughts, Jonathan Hale lingered in the back of her mind. She couldn't explain it. He wasn't like the other inmates. Where others were raw with emotion, aggression, and defiance, Jonathan was different. He was calm, collected, and disturbingly composed. He didn't scream. He didn't rattle his bars. He simply watched, quietly observing everyone around him, with a sense of detached control that seemed almost too perfect. For someone locked up for a violent crime, someone who had taken another life, he didn't seem to fit the mold. His behavior wasn't what she'd expected from someone housed in Unit 9. Instead of rage, he had an unsettling calmness that made her question what was really behind his eyes. Despite her best efforts to keep a professional distance, Jonathan kept creeping into her thoughts. She couldn't help but wonder what had made him tick, what had turned him into the man he was. Was he truly a monster, or was he a victim of circumstances? His eyes haunted her in the quiet moments, when she wasn't preoccupied with the duties of the prison. There was something magnetic about him, something that made her curious, but also made her uneasy. It was in the prison library, a small, dimly lit room filled with well-worn books and the musty scent of old paper, that their relationship began to shift. The library was an oddity in a prison like Riverton, a rare space where time seemed to slow down. It was a retreat of sorts, for both the inmates and the guards who were lucky enough to escape the daily grind of prison life for a while. Jonathan was a frequent visitor, spending hours lost in the pages of any book he could find. Amelia, who had always loved reading, volunteered to help whenever she could, eager for the distraction. The library was quiet, almost serene, compared to the rest of the facility, and that peace drew her in. At first, their interactions were innocuous, simple conversations about novels, the kind of casual discussions that could easily be dismissed. Jonathan would often ask her opinions on books she had read, or he would share his thoughts on something he was currently reading. She noticed how deep his understanding of literature was, how he spoke with such passion and insight about the authors he admired. It was unusual for an inmate, and it intrigued Amelia. But as the days went on, their conversations began to change. They grew deeper, more personal. They weren't just talking about novels anymore. They were talking about life, about philosophy, about the things that moved them. And before Amelia knew it, she was drawn into a world she never thought she'd be part of, Jonathan's world. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Amelia found herself back in the library again, trying to unwind after hours of managing the chaos of the prison. Jonathan was already there, as always, surrounded by stacks of books, a cigarette in one hand, the other turning the pages of a novel with slow, deliberate motions. When he saw her, he looked up, his expression softening just slightly. "Here," he said, pushing a book toward her. "I think you'd love this one." His tone was easy, almost comforting, and the way he spoke made her feel like she was the only one in the room. "It's about a man who loses everything and tries to rebuild his life." He paused, his gaze lingering on hers for just a moment too long. "I think you'd understand him." Amelia took the book from his outstretched hand, the brief touch sending a strange sensation through her fingers. For a moment, her mind went blank. She had seen the book before, but she hadn't paid much attention to it. Now, as she held it, there was something in his eyes, in his voice, that made her pause. "Thank you," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel her heartbeat quicken, something stirring deep inside her that she hadn't felt in years. There was something in Jonathan's presence that made her feel alive. It was like a spark that had been buried for too long, waiting for someone to reignite it. But she was supposed to ignore these feelings, to remind herself that he was just another inmate, a prisoner. Her responsibility was to maintain the law, not to lose herself in fantasies or fleeting emotions. She started to turn away, to leave the library and shake off the moment, but Jonathan's voice stopped her. "Amelia," he said, his tone different now, almost a plea. His gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time, she noticed the vulnerability hidden beneath the calm exterior. Would you have dinner with me? Just once. I promise, no complications. Just two people trying to make sense of this place." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. Dinner? With him? It was insane. She was a guard. He was an inmate. There were rules, unspoken rules that she knew better than to break. But something inside her stirred, something that told her this was more than just a fleeting thought. She felt herself drawn to him, to his calm demeanor, to the way he made her feel like she wasn't just part of the daily grind of this prison, but like she mattered. Like she had a voice in a place that had taken everything from her. She hesitated, every part of her screaming to say no, to remind herself that this wasn't right. But then there was a quiet voice, a voice she hadn't heard in a long time, whispering a different thought. What if? For the first time in years, Amelia wanted something more. Something real. Something beyond the gray walls and the constant hum of routine. Her mind raced, but before she could answer, Jonathan spoke again, his voice lower this time. Just once. We could talk. You don't have to worry about anything else. Just us. Amelia stood frozen, the book still in her hands, feeling the weight of the decision in that simple, seemingly innocent invitation. The lines of right and wrong, of duty and desire, blurred before her. She knew what she should do. She knew the consequences. But in that moment, all she could see was Jonathan's steady gaze, those eyes that seemed to see something in her she hadn't recognized in herself for years. I'll think about it, she replied, her voice barely audible, her words thick with the weight of the moment. And as she walked out of the library that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn she would never be able to turn back from. The decision had already been made. She just hadn't realized it yet. Dinner was just the beginning. Amelia had tried to tell herself that it would be a one-time thing, a casual meal between two people who found comfort in shared conversation. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and she had no control over it. The lines that had always separated her from Jonathan Hale, the guard from the prisoner, The rules from the forbidden were starting to blur. At first, it was just small gestures. Notes slipped into the corners of books, messages written on scraps of paper. Jonathan was clever. He knew how to make his words sound harmless, even innocent. He'd ask her about a book she was reading, offering his opinion on it, or share an interesting fact he had come across in his own research. And then, slowly, his notes became longer. They weren't just about books anymore. They were about them. About her. About him. Amelia found herself writing back, each reply a little more open, a little more personal. What began as a formality, a way to communicate with a prisoner she was supposed to keep at a distance, slowly morphed into something deeper. Something that was impossible to ignore. She'd catch herself thinking about Jonathan while she was on duty, wondering what he was reading, what he was doing. Sometimes, she'd look up and catch his eyes across the prison yard or the hallways, and for a moment, the entire world would disappear. It was like they were the only two people in existence. Then, it escalated. One night, long after her shift had ended, Amelia found herself walking back to cell 213. The halls were dimly lit, the usual sounds of the prison far away. Her heart raced in her chest as she glanced down the corridor, checking for guards. She had never done anything like this before, sneaking into a prisoner's cell after hours, bringing him things she knew she shouldn't. But there she was, holding a book, one that wasn't on the approved list, and a folded letter with words she had written but never thought she would. They were confessions. Her own private thoughts. Things she hadn't told anyone, not even herself. She reached his cell, her fingers trembling slightly, as she slid the letter and book through the bars. Jonathan's eyes flicked up from where he had been sitting on his bunk, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Amelia," he said softly, his voice low and almost velvety in the quiet of the night. "I thought you'd never come." It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them. The way his eyes locked with hers, that steady, knowing gaze that seemed to pull her in, forcing her to forget everything else, the rules, the consequences, her duty. She stood there, frozen for a moment, caught in his gaze. But when she finally spoke, her voice was almost as quiet as his. "I couldn't stay away," she admitted, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. She should have turned around, walked away, but she didn't. Instead, she felt herself crossing that line that was now so faint, so barely there that it was almost impossible to see. He reached out, taking the book and the letter from her hands. His fingers brushed hers just for a second, but it was enough to send a spark racing up her arm, a sensation she couldn't ignore. She pulled her hand back quickly, but the connection had already been made. Amelia could feel it, the pull between them. It was undeniable now, and she couldn't pretend otherwise. "You've been thinking about me," Jonathan said, his voice calm but filled with something darker. "You can't lie to me. I know what's been happening between us, Amelia. You're drawn to me. And you're not the first to feel that way. You're not the first to lose themselves in this place, in me." The way he spoke, the way he understood, made her feel as though she had no choice but to admit it. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, her voice filled with guilt, but also with something else. Longing? Desire? She didn't know. "I've tried to keep my distance. I thought I could ignore this." Jonathan stepped closer, his voice softer now, almost tender. "But you can't, Amelia. You're already in it. You're already mine, just like I'm yours." That word, mine, sent a shiver down her spine. She should have pulled away, should have stopped this madness. But every word Jonathan spoke, every touch, every stolen glance, made her crave more. Days turned into weeks. Amelia couldn't help herself. She found herself sneaking into his cell more often, bringing him things, books that weren't on the approved list, items that were forbidden for prisoners, little trinkets. She was crossing lines she never thought she would. She'd slip out of her quarters after hours, making sure the guards weren't around, knowing that what she was doing was reckless, dangerous, and wrong. But with every stolen moment, the connection between her and Jonathan deepened. She found herself sharing more than just books with him. They spoke about their pasts, about her life before Riverton, about his life before prison. Jonathan began to tell her things about himself, things that made Amelia look at him differently. He wasn't just an inmate. He wasn't just a man who had committed a horrific crime. He was a man with dreams, with aspirations, with hopes of a life outside these walls. He spoke of Paris, of Venice, of places he longed to visit. He told her about the life he had before everything fell apart, about the world beyond these prison walls. They shared whispered secrets in the library, their fingers brushing with every book she handed him, each touch burning hotter than the last. Amelia tried to tell herself that it was nothing, that it didn't mean anything, but deep down, she knew the truth. She was already lost. The tension between them was becoming unbearable. Every glance, every word, seemed to carry more weight. Jonathan's smile became more meaningful, his touch lingered a little longer, and Amelia found herself craving it. Craving him. But with every passing moment, the weight of her actions began to press down on her. She was breaking the rules. She was losing herself. And the pull of Jonathan's words, the promise of something more, something real, kept her coming back. She was living for those moments. For the stolen glances, the quiet conversations, the touch of his hand. In the midst of the prison's gray, lifeless walls, Jonathan was the only color in her world. One fateful day, everything changed. It happened without warning, and in a way Amelia never expected. The balance that had been precariously hanging in the air between her and Jonathan Hale, built on stolen moments and quiet confessions, finally tipped over into something darker. Jonathan had always been a man who was controlled, composed, almost unnervingly so. But that day, when he received the news that his parole had been denied, something inside him snapped. His carefully maintained facade crumbled, and for the first time, Amelia saw the raw, unrestrained rage in his eyes, the kind of anger that burned with the intensity of a wildfire. It was like a switch had been flipped, and the man who had once spoken about life with such calm confidence now stood before her, consumed by fury. Amelia was in the library, trying to focus on her duties, when Jonathan stormed in, his footsteps heavy, echoing against the stone floor. She hadn't even seen him coming, but the sheer presence of his anger was enough to make her spine stiffen. He didn't look at her at first. He was pacing, his hands clenched into fists, his back to her, as he muttered angrily under his breath. Amelia could feel the tension rising, the atmosphere in the room thickening with every passing second. Finally, he turned, and his eyes locked onto hers, eyes that were no longer filled with warmth or subtle intrigue, but with a dark intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "You knew, didn't you?" he hissed, his voice trembling with the force of his anger. The words were sharp, accusing, like a slap to her face. "You knew they'd never let me out. I gave them everything, my good behavior, my cooperation, my time spent reading those ridiculous books. I followed all their stupid rules. And for what? To stay in this hellhole forever?" His voice grew louder with each word, his body trembling with the force of his fury. Amelia instinctively took a step back. She opened her mouth to speak, to reassure him, but the words caught in her throat. She had never seen him like this. Never. Jonathan Hale was a man who had always seemed above it all, who had taken the prison's constraints in stride. And now, here he was, a man who felt as though his world had been ripped away from him. Before she could get a word out, he lunged forward, his expression wild, his chest heaving as though he couldn't catch his breath. His eyes bored into hers, and there was something in them now, something she couldn't ignore, something dangerous. His anger had taken on a life of its own, and it was more than just rage. It was the beginning of something darker, something that threatened to consume them both. "You're the one who kept me going, Amelia," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You think you've helped me? No. You've kept me trapped here. You've kept me locked in this place. You brought me books, you brought me words, you brought me everything I wanted. But you didn't give me the one thing I needed, freedom." He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers, and the air between them felt like it was about to snap. "And now I'm going to take control. I'm going to break out, and you're going to help me." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. It was as if everything in her world had suddenly shifted on its axis. The words he had just spoken, words that had sounded like a challenge, a threat, struck her with an intensity she hadn't anticipated. She opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came out. The truth had hit her like a freight train. Jonathan wasn't just angry. He wasn't just frustrated. He was desperate, and that desperation had turned into something far more dangerous. The man she had come to know, the man who had shared his thoughts and dreams with her, was gone. In his place was a man consumed by his need to escape, to break free from the walls that had confined him for so long. And in that moment, Amelia realized that she was no longer just a guard. She was part of this. She had crossed a line. "Help you?" she finally whispered, her voice trembling. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, an admission. She knew deep down that her role in all of this had changed. She was already in too deep. Jonathan's lips twisted into a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. It was a smile filled with cold calculation, the smile of a man who had spent too much time in a place where time itself had lost meaning. "I've already planned it all out, Amelia. Everything. I know where the weak points are. I know who to bribe, who to trust, and when to move. You've been helping me all along. Every note you slipped under my door, every book you brought me, every little indulgence you've allowed. It's all part of the plan. And now you're going to help me make it happen." Amelia's heart raced as the weight of his words sank in. She wanted to push him away, tell him it was impossible, but something inside her wouldn't let her. She had already been part of the plan, even if she hadn't known it at first. She had crossed every boundary she'd sworn to uphold, and now there was no going back. She could see it in his eyes, the determination, the sharp, unrelenting focus that had replaced the softness she had once seen. Jonathan Hale wasn't just a man who wanted to escape. He was a man who needed to escape at any cost. And Amelia was about to become a key part of that escape. "Amelia," he said, his voice softening just a fraction, but there was no kindness in it. "You've been my hope. You've been the one thing that kept me sane in this place. Now, I need you to be the one who helps me make it out. You're the only one I can trust." For the first time, Amelia saw the true cost of what she had gotten herself into. The promise of freedom, the temptation of something more, something real, had clouded her judgment. Now, she was standing on the edge of a precipice, and Jonathan was pulling her closer to the abyss with every word. And in that moment, she knew. She had crossed a line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Amelia had allowed herself to become tangled in Jonathan's world, and now she had no choice but to follow him, wherever that path led. The escape plan had come together with a terrifying speed. Jonathan had been meticulous, his mind always 3 steps ahead. He had everything mapped out, the guards to bribe, the weak spots in the security system, the timing. Every detail was carefully calculated, and Amelia, for better or worse, was now deeply entangled in it all. At first, she had convinced herself that she was just helping, playing her part in a plan that she couldn't see fully but was sure was just a means to get Jonathan out. Out of prison. Out of her life. But as the days passed, she began to feel the pressure of it all closing in. Her career, her life, everything she had known was slipping away. Every time she walked past those prison bars, every time she made her way to cell 213, the weight of her decisions became heavier. Jonathan had promised her freedom. A future together. The life she had dreamed of outside these walls. It sounded so perfect, so real. But in the quiet moments, when she lay awake in her bed, Amelia began to realize something. It wasn't real. None of it was. Jonathan hadn't cared about her. Not really. He had used her, just like he had used everyone in his life. The books, the notes, the conversations, they had all been tools in his game, ways to make her feel needed, wanted. She had been nothing more than a pawn in his carefully crafted plan. The man she thought she knew, the man she had fallen for, was a master manipulator. And the worst part? She had let herself fall for it. The morning of the escape was supposed to be the final step in their twisted scheme. Amelia had already prepared the forged documents, the fake logs, the blind spots in the cameras. Everything was set. She was ready, too ready. As much as she tried to ignore it, there was a part of her that knew deep down that something was wrong. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. But she couldn't back out now. It was too late for that. Amelia's shift ended late that afternoon, the oppressive weight of her thoughts only growing heavier as the day wore on. The prison laundry room was always a place where time seemed to slow down. The rhythmic hum of the machines, the pungent smell of detergent, the way the steam hung in the air, it felt almost suffocating. It was the perfect place for Jonathan to meet her. And when he appeared, his face hardened by the news of the escape, his eyes cold, there was no turning back. "Amelia," Jonathan said, his voice low and controlled, but there was a bite to it. "I need more from you. More than what you've given me already." She stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. She had been foolish to think that Jonathan was just a man she could help. He wanted more. He had always wanted more. The freedom she had imagined for them both had never been the real goal. It was about power. Control. "I've done everything you asked," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the washing machines. "I've broken the rules. I've put everything on the line for you. What more do you want?" Jonathan's gaze darkened. "You know what I want, Amelia," he said with a mocking smile. "I want you to give me everything. Every last bit of your loyalty, your trust, your soul. I want you to help me escape this place, and not just with a few fake papers. You're going to be part of it. You're going to make sure I get out of here. And once I'm free, we'll start our life together, just like you promised me." The way he said it, so confident, so assured, struck her like a punch. It wasn't the words themselves, but the realization that she had never truly been in control. She had thought she was helping him escape to a better life, but now she saw it clearly. He had been using her, manipulating her all along, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Amelia tried to take a step back, to break away from him. But Jonathan took a step forward, his presence now overpowering. His eyes were no longer soft, no longer the calm gaze that had drawn her in. They were sharp, cold, and calculating, like a predator watching its prey. He had backed her into a corner, and she had nowhere to go. "You're mine now, Amelia," he growled, his voice low, the edge of something terrifying in it. "I've given you everything you could ever want. You have no choice. I'll make sure of it." She felt a surge of panic rising in her chest. Her breath quickened, and for the first time, she saw Jonathan for who he truly was. He wasn't the man she thought she knew, the charming, intellectual man who spoke of Paris and Venice. No. This was the man who had manipulated her into believing in a future that didn't exist, a man who had used her desperation, her loneliness, and her need for affection as weapons. And as Jonathan's smile twisted into something darker, something almost predatory, something inside Amelia snapped. The anger that had been building within her, the fear, the guilt, all coalesced into one overwhelming emotion. She had been a fool. She had let him play her like a puppet. But not anymore. She would take control. She would end this. Her eyes flicked to the workbench where the tools were laid out, and there it was, the wrench. Cold. Heavy. The very tool she had passed by countless times without a second thought. But now, it was the only thing that could end this nightmare. Without thinking, Amelia grabbed the wrench, her hands trembling around the cold steel. Jonathan didn't see it coming. He was still speaking, his words mocking her, pushing her, trying to break her. But in that moment, Amelia wasn't listening. She was beyond listening. In one swift movement, she swung the wrench, the metal connecting with Jonathan's skull with a sickening thud. The sound was drowned out by the deafening hum of the washing machines, but the shock of the blow was enough to send Jonathan sprawling to the floor. He looked up at her, dazed, his face already beginning to swell. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. The world around her seemed to slow as she stood over him, the wrench still gripped tightly in her hands. The man who had held her in his grasp was now at her mercy. But she wasn't done. The anger inside her, the frustration, the years of feeling trapped, all poured out in a violent surge. She raised the wrench again, and again, and again, each blow landing with a sickening crunch, the sound muffled by the relentless noise of the machines. When it was over, Amelia stood frozen in the laundry room, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Jonathan lay before her, his body lifeless, the wrench beside him covered in blood. She stared at the scene in front of her, unable to comprehend what had just happened. It was like a dream, like she was watching someone else's nightmare unfold. The escape, the promises, the light in the cold steel. Jonathan didn't see it coming. He was still speaking, his words mocking her, pushing her, trying to break her. But in that moment, Amelia wasn't listening. She was beyond listening. In one swift movement, she swung the wrench, the metal connecting with Jonathan's skull with a sickening thud. The sound was drowned out by the deafening hum of the washing machines, but the shock of the blow was enough to send Jonathan sprawling to the floor. He looked up at her, dazed, his face already beginning to swell. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. The world around her seemed to slow as she stood over him, the wrench still gripped tightly in her hands. The man who had held her in his grasp was now at her mercy. But she wasn't done. The anger inside her, the frustration, the years of feeling trapped, all poured out in a violent surge. She raised the wrench again, and again, and again, each blow landing with a sickening crunch, the sound muffled by the relentless noise of the machines. When it was over, Amelia stood frozen in the laundry room, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Jonathan lay before her, his body lifeless, the wrench beside him covered in blood. She stared at the scene in front of her, unable to comprehend what had just happened. It was like a dream, like she was watching someone else's nightmare unfold. The escape, the promises, the life she had imagined, they all seemed so far away now. The reality of what she had just done hit her all at once. She had taken a life. But there was no turning back now. Jonathan was dead. And she had killed him. In the aftermath of the murder, the scene was carefully staged to appear like a typical prison fight gone wrong, an altercation between two inmates that escalated into deadly violence. The security logs were forged, the evidence planted, and a false trail was quickly laid out, leading everyone to believe that Ray Harris, a known troublemaker, was responsible for Jonathan Hale's death. It seemed like a clean cover-up, a story that would hold under scrutiny. But Detective Samuel Hayes wasn't fooled. He had been on enough cases to know when something didn't add up. From the moment the crime scene was discovered, his instincts told him there was more to the story than met the eye. The evidence was too perfect. The timing was too convenient. The murder weapon, a wrench, had been placed back on the shelf in the laundry room with a kind of precision that suggested someone knew exactly how to stage a scene. Hayes had been trained to spot the smallest inconsistencies, and there were plenty. Amelia's behavior stood out immediately. She was calm, almost too calm, for someone involved in the murder of a man she had supposedly spent months helping. The way she had handled the situation after the crime, going through the motions as if nothing had changed, raised red flags. The forged visitation logs were the first crack in the facade. The missing security footage was the second. There was an undeniable pattern of irregularities surrounding Amelia's actions, and Hayes wasn't about to let them go unnoticed. As the investigation unfolded, Hayes dug deeper. He began to piece together a timeline, and what he discovered shocked him. It wasn't just the inconsistencies in the records, it was the letters. Dozens of letters. The kind of letters that no one should ever send in a place like Riverton. Letters filled with intimate confessions, passionate promises, and whispers of a future that had no place in a prison. The letters were addressed to Jonathan Hale, of course, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Amelia's handwriting. At first, Hayes was reluctant to believe what he was seeing. He couldn't fathom that a guard, someone sworn to uphold the law, could have crossed that line. But as he read through the letters, the truth began to surface. Amelia had fallen for Jonathan Hale. She had let herself be manipulated, pulled into a relationship that was never about love, but about control. Jonathan hadn't cared for her. He had used her, just like he had used everyone else in his life. But Amelia had been too blind to see it. By the time she realized the truth, it was too late. She was already trapped in a world where her own guilt and obsession had consumed her. It was a cold afternoon when Amelia was finally brought in for questioning. The prison's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unfeeling light on the stark, sterile room. She sat across from Detective Hayes, her posture stiff and tense, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The walls felt like they were closing in around her, and for the first time, Amelia realized that there was nowhere to run, no one to hide behind. She was alone with the truth, and the truth was a weight that threatened to crush her. Hayes sat back in his chair, his gaze steady and calm, studying her with the practiced eye of a seasoned investigator. His voice was even, almost dispassionate, but there was an edge to it, a quiet certainty that told Amelia he already knew everything. "You didn't have to kill him," Hayes said, his voice breaking the silence, calm but laden with accusation. "You could have walked away. You could have turned yourself in before it got to this point. But you didn't. You let your obsession consume you." Amelia's eyes flickered down to her hands, the tears already welling in her eyes. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to scream at him, tell him that he didn't understand, that Jonathan had been different, that she had been a victim too. But the words caught in her throat. Deep down, she knew it wasn't true. Jonathan hadn't cared about her. He hadn't loved her. He had used her for his own escape, and when she realized that, it was already too late. Hayes continued, his voice softening, but the weight of his words pressed on her chest like a vice. "You let him manipulate you. You let him make you believe that there was a future for the two of you. But there was never a future, Amelia. Not with him. He used you. And now, a man is dead." The truth of it hit her with a force she couldn't deny. She had been so blind, so desperate. Desperate for affection, for validation, for something real in a world that had stripped her of everything she had ever known. And Jonathan had known exactly how to play her. He had made her feel special, needed, wanted. He had promised her a life beyond these walls. A life they could build together. But it was all a lie. Amelia's eyes welled with tears, the dam finally breaking. She could feel her chest tightening, the weight of her guilt, the horror of what she had done, crashing down on her. There was no denying it anymore. She had crossed the line. She had killed him. "I loved him," she whispered through her tears, her voice trembling with the enormity of the confession. "I loved him, and I killed him." The words hung in the air between them, each syllable a heavy weight that pulled her deeper into the abyss. She had loved him. Loved the idea of him, the version of him that he had allowed her to see. But that wasn't the man who lay dead on the laundry room floor. The man she had loved had never existed. The truth was, she had been just another pawn in his game, and by the time she realized it, it was already too late. Hayes didn't say anything for a moment. He simply watched her, his face inscrutable. He had seen this kind of breakdown before. The guilt, the realization, the desperate need to make it stop, to take back the past. But it was too late for that. It was too late for Amelia to undo what she had done. The confession poured out of her then, all the things she had been holding inside for so long. The affair, the manipulation, the lies, the murder. She told him everything, about the books, the letters, the escape plan, about how Jonathan had used her to get out of prison, and how she had fallen deeper and deeper into a relationship that was never about love, but about control. "I didn't know what to do anymore," she sobbed. "I couldn't stop. He was everything I wanted. And then I realized too late that I was just a tool to him. And when he threatened me, when he threatened to expose everything, I couldn't let him. I couldn't lose everything." Hayes listened in silence, letting her words wash over him. He didn't need to say much. She had already admitted it all. She had confessed. And now, the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. As the confession ended, Amelia sank into the chair, her body racked with sobs. The tears streamed down her face, but they didn't bring any relief. The weight of what she had done, of what she had allowed herself to become, was more than she could bear. Jonathan had promised her freedom. He had promised her a future. And now, she had nothing but a cold, empty cell, and the bitter knowledge that she had killed a man she had once loved. Detective Hayes stood up, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned to leave the room. His work here was done. Amelia's confession would seal her fate. The truth had been uncovered. There was nothing left to hide. Amelia's trial was swift, almost clinical in its execution. The evidence was undeniable, each piece carefully pieced together, exposing the web of lies and manipulation she had spun around herself. The love letters, the forged documents, the forged visitation logs, the confessions she had made to Detective Hayes, it was all there. Every detail was laid bare in the courtroom for everyone to see, and there was no escaping the truth. The courtroom was cold, unfeeling. The judge sat high above the proceedings, his expression impassive, almost detached, as the prosecutor laid out the case against Amelia. The room was filled with hushed whispers, some murmurs of disbelief, others of condemnation. But Amelia barely registered them. She had grown numb to it all. She had learned that silence was safer than speaking. The shock of her own actions, the weight of her own guilt, made it impossible for her to focus on anything but the inevitable. Her defense attorney tried to argue that Amelia had been manipulated, that she had been a victim of Jonathan Hale's mind games. He painted a picture of a lonely woman, desperate for affection, who had been seduced by a man who promised her a life beyond the prison walls. He emphasized her remorse, her cooperation with the investigation, and the emotional toll that her relationship with Hale had taken on her. But even his words seemed empty in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The love letters, written in her own hand, painted a clear picture. There was no way to deny it anymore. As the prosecutor spoke, her words were sharp and unforgiving, every sentence a reminder of the cold, calculated act Amelia had committed. She was not a victim, Your Honor. She was a willing accomplice in a scheme to escape justice. A guard, sworn to uphold the law, who instead chose to betray it in the most horrific way imaginable. She crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. And now, a man is dead. Amelia sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her mind replayed every decision, every action that had led to this moment. The stolen books, the late-night conversations, the forbidden kisses, the lies. How had it all come to this? How had she let herself fall so deeply into a relationship with someone who never cared for her? She could still see Jonathan's face, his cold, unrelenting gaze, the way he had used her, manipulated her, and ultimately pushed her to the brink. His promises of freedom, of a future together, had been a lie that had cost a man his life, a life that she had taken with her own hands. The moment of reckoning arrived when the jury filed into the room, their faces solemn, their expressions grave. The judge's voice echoed through the quiet courtroom as he read the verdict aloud. Guilty. Guilty of premeditated murder. The words felt like a death sentence to Amelia, not just because of the prison sentence she would face, but because of the life she had destroyed, the life that she had taken. Her whole world, the one she had built up in her mind, the one she had dreamed of, crumbled in that instant. The guilt washed over her like a flood, drowning her in the realization that there was no way to undo what she had done. There was no second chance, no redemption. Jonathan was gone, and no amount of remorse could bring him back. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in prison. 15 years for the life she had taken. 15 years for the man who had once seemed like her salvation, but who had ultimately been the cause of her downfall. And as the gavel came down, the sound echoed in her ears, drowning out the murmur of the courtroom. It was final. It was over. But even as the sentence was handed down, even as the tears welled up in Amelia's eyes, the damage had already been done. The true weight of her actions wasn't in the time she would serve behind bars. It was in everything she had lost. As she was escorted out of the courtroom, the whispers followed her like a dark shadow. People stared at her, some with pity, others with contempt. It didn't matter. They didn't know her. They didn't know what it had been like to feel that intense pull of desire, that desperate need to be loved, to be seen. They didn't understand how easy it had been for Jonathan to manipulate her, to make her believe in a future that never existed. Amelia was placed in a holding cell, waiting for the transport to take her to a maximum security facility. She sat there, numb, her body stiff and cold, but her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and memories. The day she had arrived at Riverton. The first time she had locked eyes with Jonathan. The way his calm, controlled demeanor had drawn her in. And now, the reality of it all, the prison walls that would confine her for the next 15 years, the endless days of isolation, and the haunting knowledge that she had killed a man. Her career was over. Her life as she had known it was over. She had lost everything, her job, her reputation, and any semblance of freedom she once had. But more than that, she had lost herself. She had lost the person she had once been, the one who had followed the rules, the one who believed in justice and order. Now, she was just another prisoner, someone who had let obsession cloud her judgment and destroy her life. As the transport bin drove away, Amelia stared out the small window, watching the world she knew fade into the distance. She thought of the days before everything had gone wrong, the days when she had felt in control, when she had been a part of something bigger, something important. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. And then, as the van turned a corner, she caught one last glimpse of the prison, of Riverton Correctional Facility. The place that had once felt like a secure, structured world. The place where she had spent so many years, keeping order, maintaining control. Now, it was just a memory, a reminder of the lines she had crossed, the rules she had broken, and the man she had killed. And as the van drove farther away, Amelia realized that no matter how much time passed, no matter how many years she served, she would never escape the prison of her own making. The guilt would stay with her. The memories would haunt her, just as they had from the very beginning. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the heavy metal door of her new cell clanged shut, a sharp, final sound that reverberated through her entire being, Amelia felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest. The noise echoed, louder than it had ever before, as if it were sealing her fate once and for all. She was no longer a guard, no longer the one who had sworn to protect, to uphold the law. She had lost that identity the moment she crossed the line with Jonathan. In the blink of an eye, everything she had known had vanished. She wasn't part of the system anymore. She was trapped in it. The irony was crushing. For years, she had been a part of the institution, a cog in the machine, believing she was helping to maintain order. But now, she was just another inmate, just another prisoner in a world of her own making. The cell was stark and cold, the walls bare and unforgiving. The silence was louder than any noise. She sat on the narrow cot, staring blankly at the walls, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. She wasn't just incarcerated physically, she was imprisoned by the choices she had made, by the man who had used her and manipulated her, by her own desperate need for affection and approval. For so long, Jonathan had been the center of her world. She had convinced herself that he was her escape, her way out of the great prison that had become her life. He had promised her freedom, a life together beyond these walls. But now, in the stillness of her new cell, Amelia understood the true price of those promises. She had been a prisoner long before the physical bars closed behind her. She had allowed herself to be manipulated, had allowed her need for love to blind her to the reality of Jonathan's intentions. He had never cared for her. He had used her, just as he had used everyone else in his life. And now, she was left to pick up the shattered pieces of her own broken heart. The truth was inescapable. She had fallen victim to her own desires, to the need for something real, for something meaningful, and in doing so, she had destroyed everything that once mattered. And as the darkness of the cell pressed in around her, the cold realization hit harder than any punishment could. She was trapped, trapped not just by the prison walls, but by the choices she had made, by the lies she had believed. There was no escaping that. If you found this story as gripping as we did, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true crime stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We have many more shocking cases coming your way. Join the community and stay connected as we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew.